Hello fellow engineers and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Nasty. Today's video we're talking all about recyclers and specifically how to void materials with them. So I've covered in the past how you can do this at varying levels of mining productivity, and I have a video on that specifically. Today I want to see if we can optimize this and get a better understanding of what the true costs are for voiding materials using recyclers, especially in a extreme volume like we're doing with ore. So that's going to be the idea today. We're going to do a deep dive into recyclers, see if we can figure out what causes them to have a higher update time. Can we do things to optimize them a little bit further? And hopefully this is not only applicable for ore voiding, but also for concepts that when we eventually get over to Fulgora that we can use there to improve some of the update time for recyclers. So stick around, we're going to get right into the video. So the design you're seeing in front of you is the design that I currently use in my Megabase. The core concepts when I was originally designing this was I wanted to just void the material fast enough, but also make this compact enough so that I could tile it. So there's a couple things that I wound up doing for this. There's a chest here. This chest is monitored to check how much iron ore is in there. And so anytime that it's a latching condition, it's an RS latch, it just will pause anytime that the ore is greater than or equal to 400, and then it will restart whenever it's greater than 264 again. So that's kind of the idea, is to kind of keep it in a range of 264 to 400. 264 is chosen because there are 200 items in here, so if one of them happens to get unbalanced and you have less than another in the other chest, that way we just kind of account for that. So the idea that I had when I was originally designing this was I want this to just naturally void the material as fast as possible, and to void the material, what you wind up needing is practically, in order to get 240 items per second, you need to void 400 items of normal quality coming out of this chest. Now, you're going to destroy a little bit more than that, right? Because 25% of that is going to get recreated. So that really means that you're going to need 400 plus 100, so you're going to get up to 500. And then out of that 100, you're going to have a chance of getting 25 of that again, so that'd be plus 25. And then when you get, again, a quarter of this, it keeps on going, you know, it basically keeps on repeating. So in essence, as long as, and just to do the math here, 25 times 0.25, so we're going to get 6.25. So add all this up, and then there's one more potential craft that you can get out of this. So we'll copy this and we'll do one more time. So that's kind of where the remainder is. So as long as you're like over 532 items that you're voiding per second, you get to the point where you can produce 240 common quality. And that's because the quality that's in the miner here is 24.8%. So, and we can also verify this here. A nice kind of handy tip is you can execute this particular command to get the speed bonus. You'll see that for this in particular, it's a negative speed multiplier, and that's coming from the quality. And then let's do a quality bonus. See if we can do that, if that actually exists. Okay, so after some fiddling around, I figured out how to actually extract the quality effect from here. So the quality here, what's kind of interesting is that it's 2.48%, or which is 24.8% because everything is truncated or rounded to 2 decimal places by truncation in Factorio. So when you look at that, you can see that the UI is actually kind of accurate here, being 24.8%. When I originally did some of the math, I had assumed that this was a quality multiplier of 6.25%. And the reason being because the quality modules themselves, right, normally it has a normal impact of 2.5%. Every time that you're calculating the quality effect, you should see something like the base number being 2.5%, and then you'd multiply for each one times 1.3, 1.6, 1.9, and 2.5. That's normally how that quality effect is calculated. And at least that's in the base game, that these are the multipliers that are used behind the scenes when you're calculating something. This is in my simulator calculator, so this is not like source code of factorial or something in case you're confused, but just want to point that out that that's normally what it is. So if you took that value and you computed that, you'd see that this is 0.0625, right? That's what that winds up being. Or really, if you had 2.5, you multiply that, that'd be 6.25. So in essence, this is what's kind of odd to me, is I would assume that when you add all of these quality modules together, that the total quality bonus that you would get, right, times 4, should be exactly 25%. But for some reason, and I can't explain why this is, if you look at the actual effect here, it's 2.48. And 2.48 divided by 4 is 0.62. So it seems like what's going on is it's truncating the quality bonus to 2 decimal points every time it adds it together, which is kind of unfortunate for quality because you could get a really nice whole 25%, but because the way that they're computing things behind the scenes, you only get 24.8% total quality on the miner. So that throws the math a little bit off. I had assumed 25% when I was doing a lot of these calculations, so that was some of the error that I had. It'd be nice if that was actually taking the full quality bonus, because although, yeah, it is just, you know, it's a 0.2% difference when you're voiding, you know, 1,000 items times 0.248. That means that you get 248 items out of there, whereas you would normally get 2 more per second, right? That you're going to be getting for uncommon. So it's not a huge deal, but over the course of, like, you know, 2 items times 60, that's 120 items a minute. It's not a huge difference, right? So that rounding error just doesn't make that big of a difference. But when the recyclers are so expensive, it's like, if I could get basically a pause for 1 second every, or half a second every minute, that'd be already a UPS savings just from this quality. So this impacts more me than anything else, but it is just kind of an issue that kind of exists just due to the way that quality or any kind of effect is always rounded by truncation, so you don't get the exact numbers that you would expect sometimes behind, like when you're calculating things. So anyway, so some of the things that, like, overall with this design, now that we've kind of gone through that segue of the quality calculation, is that then the math would effectively work out in that way that I had said, which is 530, but really in practice you need like closer to like 540 items per second that you're voiding, so due to some of the rounding differences. So just a heads up in case you're ever trying to calculate these things yourself, especially with quality, that it's rounded and truncated. So something to just kind of be mindful of. So that out of the way, the concepts that I don't like about this design, or at least I'll take that back. The items, what I liked about this design was that it would actually have a full period of starting and stopping whenever these chests would get full. So this was kind of a nice way that if you changed, you know, the belt speed to something else here, you'd see that this would naturally start and stop more often because this chest would get back pressured faster. So there'd be shorter periods where this would actually have to void. So that's kind of nice because this is dynamic, because it just would kind of void materials when needed, rather than having to do it on expecting a full 240 per second output. So that was kind of a nice benefit of this design. But what I don't like and what I wanted to explore was the recyclers. So with that being said, so this was design A, latched on, off. This is the current one that's in my base, that's based on the quality in the steel chests. The next design that I came up with when I was experimenting with this was like, let's reduce the number of recyclers total that we have to make 240 items per second. So this is significantly over beaconed, right? We said that we need about 540 or so items, normal quality, that gets destroyed every single second. So for this is almost 2 times that amount. And what you can kind of see here is I created a clock here that turns on and off the recyclers based on a tick interval here. And the idea was that this would always keep items constantly in the input slot. That way the items in here, you can still see that this will occasionally flicker. But you'll see on the bottom left-hand side that recipe icon. You can see that it is constantly, almost all the time, saying that the recipe is iron ore recycling. That was one concept that I wanted specifically, and that it would never drop below the recipe. So because then it would maybe potentially consider it a state transition, that it's switching recipes to nothing, even though it still shows that the recycler input beforehand was iron ore before. So that was the idea. And then I just had and this is, you're going to see this for all the rest of the design, so I'll cover this really quick. There's a known rate at which you're going to have to pull out the other qualities just based on your consumption rate that's going to be coming out here at 240 per second. So the interval then here is a clock that wraps around every 3,600 ticks. That's the main clock. That's going to say how often I'm going to pull out iron ore. And then rare is going to be every 400 ticks is when I'm going to go and potentially try to swing twice. And then every 76 ticks, there's going to be rare is going to be trying to be pulled out 2 times from this particular chest here. So, and that's what you're seeing here, is that this is constantly just pulling the items out, and it's just setting filters on this particular clock here. So that way we could use stack inserters. That was something that I didn't use here. Here I just use bulk inserters with anything greater than or equal to rare. And so you can see here that this is constantly recipe switching, and I had some extra logic in here that was wind up saying like, hey, it's not working at all. There's no items getting crafted. Okay, now you can put something in. This isn't ideal because this is constantly running, whereas this is just very occasionally swinging twice, and the recipe is almost all the time just rare. So that was kind of the idea, to improve that, reduce recipe switching. And that was like the core concept here for B, was just let's try a concept of clocking recyclers, clocking everything on a fixed clock and an interval. The downside to this design is it's not dynamic to the previous design, where it would slow down or have longer resting periods if the consumption wasn't exactly 240 per second. So that makes this more finicky because you have to always be constantly consuming this. Otherwise, you will get to the point where the clock actually could hurt you more, and you'll go back to having this empty out all the time. So that was the other idea. And throughout all of these, I'm calling these designs A, B, C, respectively. That's just each iteration is just a new letter, and that's just to keep it easy for me to kind of remember them. And then in the benchmarks that I have in the end, there is an index guide that just has all these nice little descriptions. I just copied them from my description README. So C is exactly the same as B, but the difference is that it has no clocking at all. And so you're going to see here, this is constantly pulsing and removing items all the time. And it is constantly switching states. So it is almost all the time can instantly void the items faster than it can actually take them out. And the downside of this is you're going to see that here, most of the time this is grabbing 16, but there's occasionally here, there's times where when this is swinging, it can't grab exactly 16 items. And what it winds up doing, especially when this drops too low, is this is going to grab, a few items at a time and can't fully grab 16 items every single stack. So I'm not showing it here, but occasionally it will happen where it runs out of items that it can grab. And so it will take a few more ticks, like there, about 15, 16 items to go and grab it. So that's also more updates that are happening to the miner, respectively. If you watch this, you can see how much more this is flickering over here. So this is now essentially when items are getting pulled out, there's another calculation. Can I put something in from the miner into here? And is there space for it, especially if the next slot happened to be uncommon ore? So that was kind of the idea then. Here was no clocking at all, but just letting the recyclers just void as fast as possible. But when you look at this and compare these two, the wait lists are not that high. So like these seem to be running all the time. This one just has a slightly slower resting period. So there shouldn't be, and just by observation, there shouldn't be a huge difference. The big difference here is just how many times this is turning on and off like this. So that was the core concept. Now, by the way, the reason I used cars here was just to kind of test the theory. Is like an inserter cheaper than a recycler, going back to back next to each other? So then this was then iterated on. So then here is a similar concept to what we had with B, but we removed all the extra beacons, and we have now an exact speed here. So this is 540 items per second. So that was that number that I said in the beginning. This is now constantly in a state where you should have back pressure on iron ore all the time, with very occasionally you getting to the point where you almost run out just due to the balance between normal quality and uncommon. So, and this is also a very nice thing here, because you can see if we go and do the crafting speed, Oops, let's put that in correctly. This is an actual full value here. So the crafting speed is 16.875, whereas the numbers over here, if we look at the crafting speed, that's an irrational number. So not that that's a huge difference, but what's kind of funny about this is if you look at the progress bar, it doesn't move at all. This is running in real time, so it's just because of just the way that this works. The progress on this exactly wraps around every single tick back to 0. So it's perfect in terms of, it looks like it's not working, but it is actually working. This progress bar just doesn't move. So I thought that was kind of a funny effect of getting this at the perfect speed here. So this was the concept, and I wanted to explore like, hey, is this better than, let's say, having a nice clocked version like this, or especially like just over beaconing? Like the main difference between F and C that I want to kind of compare is this constantly running out like this and being over beaconed. Is it just better to just reduce the number of beacons that you have and just have the machine working 24/7 and never stopping? So that was the concept there. We iterated from there, and also worked with a couple people in my Discord channel. So I worked with the N specifically. So he had originally a design that looked like this, and also just from a symmetry standpoint, I really, really like this. So this used epic inserters, and the concept here was to be able to unload the items and exactly make 240 items per second. So epic inserters are really good for that because 4 of them all connected to each other, and you can even see there's this sneaky one under here that you don't see. But if per side or per lane, epic inserters are perfectly matched in terms of their speed to be able to perfectly fill a turbo belt without ever having to stop or become idle. So in this particular configuration, if I flip these all out for legendary, this would potentially be worse with legendary. So because of just them being output blocked more often. So this is actually a pretty nice design. Just when the big difference here is it gets one more inserter here to get all 4 of these, to get a total of 8 inserters voiding back and forth. And so this design used some of the concepts that I created for clocking. So this uses the same ore extractor for quality, but then winds up having individual clocks for each of the different recyclers. So similar clocking, just slightly altered based on the speed of these. And you can see too here that there wasn't a care in terms of like having a perfect speed on these recyclers. So this one actually happens to have a nice number, and then this one is irrational, but that's also fine. The idea is just, clock them and set that. So that was the test that was going to be done here. From there, I wound up going and taking this design and saying, I'm curious what happens if we use just 3 quality 5 or legendary stack inserters instead of the 4. And so I did some kind of some shenanigans here with the direction that the belts are always getting unloaded to, and then also just squeezing barely in here a turbo splitter belt so that we could get the ability to use all 3. And there's even a sneaky legendary one under here as well, underneath the cargo wagon, to get them to all line up perfectly here. And you can see also there's no gaps when I'm pressing F5. There's no white lines that are coming out here. And all these designs don't have that, so none of them have any flow gaps in it. The downside to these designs is that although these are always starting and stopping and never running out of items, the moment that you wind up putting, and I'll show even this on my own design, if I slow down the output here to this situation, you're going to see that these inserters are going to run out of items that they can actually pick up. So, and then this actually starts flickering in the same way that it did before. So then potentially, if you're not consuming at the speed that you want to, especially when it's so much drastically slower than this, there won't be a resting time and you'll still have the constant flickering of miners. The miners actually have kind of an expensive cost, just like the recyclers, with starting and stopping all the time, especially at high mining productivity. So that was kind of a thing that I wanted to just call out first before I go into this. So like if you're going to use, let's say, any of these clocked versions, you got to be a little bit more careful about what is your consumption rate downstream, because they will just keep running constantly. The downside too is if you use this for research, you're not running, let's say, red, green, or blue science, then the cost attributed to this when you turn off that particular science, let's say purple science, will be much higher because this clock has no way to turn off. So that's something that you could do. You could send a global signal, maybe with radars on Novice, to get to the particular clock so that it could say, hey, we're not running this science anymore, and then could turn them off. So that's something that could be done after the fact, but just some things that to keep in mind when you're using this, that these versions need a little bit more care, and this version here just kind of worked out of the box, and that's one of the reasons I designed it this way. But if these perform significantly better in general, then that is going to be worth the extra complexity. It's so if it's like 1% better, then no, it's not worth it. But if it's more than that, like let's say 5 to 10 or even 20% better, then this design is worth it, and being very careful about where the consumptions are and fully turning off the clocks when needed. Cool. So now I've kind of given an overview of the main evolutions of this design here. So let's go and talk through some of the benchmark results and get into the data. So as always, any of these benchmark results that you wind up seeing are going to be available on my GitHub page. You can go back and read this whenever you want to. There's going to be in the video description always a link to any of the benchmarks that I showcase in the video, and you can go back and read it and then just get an overall short summary on it. So with that being said, all the designs, I showcased a handful of them, but there's more designs that were included in here. So all the way from A all the way to L. So, and when you look at this on GitHub, you'll see nice little screenshots of them, and you can click on them and you can look at what the design is, and you can get kind of an idea of it. And then you can also get the description of what changed from one version to another for comparisons. So let's go and look at the benchmarks. So A was the first version that I created. Now I want to call out A and also especially C here because those are the most interesting to me. So what we'll do is let's move this over to let's open one of these images here. So I want to talk about A and I want to talk about C. So I'll click this. So for A, let's grab C here. Let's look at that one. And then the other one that I want to compare especially is B, because B and C are exactly the same. The only difference is that it has clocked recyclers. So let's talk about that one as well. So the difference between B and C is just you're going to see here, there's no wires at all connected to it. And then design A is the version that had the on-off latching of it, but always constantly running recyclers. So it's more similar in terms of the recycler layout to something like design C here with no clocking, just over beaconed and over just voiding the materials. And then B is the clocked version of it. So let's go and look at the results here and talk through those. And I'll move this over here to the side, and let's grab all of these over here and we can talk about them respectively. So the main items that are kind of interesting when we look at this is that you can see that this version here, C, and then look at B here. Clocking the recycler or not clocking it and over beaconing the recyclers performed actually worse than my original design that I have currently running in my Megabase. So what's interesting about that is that when you look at this was 1% worse than the current version that I have in my Megabase. But then when you look at version B here, well, the difference between this is only 0.3% worse than the best version that we created. But the version C is 25% worse. So the constant starting and stopping over beaconed recyclers seems to be really bad for performance. Because, and this is where you can kind of think about this in terms of some numbers here. Well, the recycler, we know, can void 830 items per second. So that's at least the speed that that particular recycler is set up to be able to void. And let me double check that by looking at Factorio over here. So this is that version, that design, that's actually 852 items per second that it can void. So how many items can it void per tick? So 852 divided by 60, well, that's 14 items per tick that it could void. So every time that you put an item in here, so with 16 items, it will take 2 ticks to destroy the item. And when it's constantly running out like this, then you will constantly have a starting and stopping every other tick is kind of what's going on. Well, and now because you're grabbing with 4 items that are coming in, that won't be always every other tick. This will be 1, 2, 3, it's off, 1, 2, off. You're seeing that as I continue to progress here, I'm going 1 tick in the future at a time. So this would be 1 tick, 2 ticks, 3 ticks, 4 ticks, 5 ticks, 6 ticks, 7 ticks, 8 ticks, 9 ticks, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. It's constantly starting and stopping, only running for maybe 3 ticks at a time. So that means that it has a very low duty cycle that it's actually running, and it's almost completely avoiding all the materials completely by the time that the inserters even swing around. And since this inserter takes 4 ticks to swing and put something in here, and then 4 ticks to swing back, by the time that this is swinging back, it's already voided all the materials that are inside the recycler, pretty much. So especially when they start to get offset like this. And that's where you're seeing that pattern of them starting and stopping at different periods, is because these inserters are no longer in sync, because you're getting completely backed up on uncommon and having very small trickles of iron ore actually coming into here. Whereas with some of these other designs, you're seeing that the inserters are pretty much perfectly in sync all the time due to the clocking method. So this has a very fixed start and stop cadence with occasionally some offset swings that are happening. You see the same thing on this design here, where they are for the most part constantly filling it, but it's never running out. So that's the main benefit, is that it's always every single tick voiding. In this case here is 740 items. So this is constantly voiding 12.3 items every single tick. So it's never stopping on that regard. And the design up here, same thing, but just has a shorter on-off cycle because it only has 3 inserters getting into it. Cool. Let's go back to VS Code. So it seems like from that initial benefit of clocking recyclers is that constant start and stop is expensive for the recyclers themselves. And also for the inserters, because they have to constantly check the chest. Can I put something in? Can I take something out? Can I grab them? And it overall made it so much worse that it was even worse than the original design by just not clocking it. So it seems like clocking them, specifically the recyclers to turn on and off, makes a big difference. Now note specifically that I did not clock the inserters. And the reason I did that is because I didn't find it to be useful to clock all the inserters together. Because my thought was this: they're running most of the time 100% active. So adding extra control logic into these individual these inserters means that I now have, per 240 items per second, I have 8 items connected to a circuit network that all have a slight overhead that is constantly, just due to the nature of being connected to the circuit network, they're going to have an overhead. So in my mind, I was like, well, they are only going to start and stop very infrequently. So for that reason, just let them naturally just use waitlist would be better for this particular application, and clock then 1 item for 4 items. So a 1-to-4 ratio. So just clock the recycler itself. That seemed like a better solution, which is exactly what we did over in Design B. And that's what I did here. None of the other inserters are clocked at all. Everything is just outputting onto a belt. And then just the recyclers are setting the cadence for when we are voiding in materials. And that's where we saw that already the bulk of the improvement came from that. Now, I want to go through some of the other designs where there were very slight modifications that improved things. So design F, I'll go and open up as well, coming from design B. Let's open that up. So design F is the same as design B. The only difference is now the 2 inserters that are on the top pulling into the act from the cars are now clocked. So then they can start and stop. And that's where we saw between design F and design B a 0.46% difference. So not a huge net delta between these two. So it still seems like the recycler itself being clocked, it's and naturally by the number of beacons that we have, seem to be already just the main benefit here of just constantly running the recycler rather than short cycling and turning it off. So that was the next thing. So the iteration then from that I think had more of an interesting note is where we saw like, okay, from here, if you look at each of these are very, very small improvements. We're talking 0.59%, 0.13%, 0.29%, 0.78%. And the differences kind of started to not matter as much as we went up in terms of the optimizations from here, but I just want to point them out. So the next kind of leap in this entire kind of design was design H. So design H is the design that the N came up with. And his design makes a lot of sense in a lot of different reasons. So it has a lot of beacons around everything, and it has one extra inserter that can pull items into a wooden chest. It's just for having very small inventory size, and then going into the recyclers that are double facing like this. So this goes from the design that we had, which was design F or design B, where we had this over beaconing but clocked version, and just had them now double facing into each other. So the benefit there was that now you could get a total of 8 items, and you could remove the dependency of the extra recycler here. So it's still using 2 recyclers, it's just facing them into each other to remove the extra inventory transactions that are happening from these inserters. The net difference in terms of this version versus the design that I had just shown, which was design F, is in aggregate about a 2.5, 2.6% increase from there. So that's already, so that is, if you look at these individually, it's not that big of a deal, but like if you look at from design H to design F that I showed before, double facing inserters seem to be better. And that's just because there was less overall transactions that were happening in terms of inventory from one chest to another going back and forth. Although cars were cool, this showed to just be that just have them double facing into each other, that's fine. That's in this particular case was better. So then from there, the improvements that come from this are even more minuscule. So the only real, and so I'll just jump immediately to design L. So design L is the final design that I wound up coming up with, which is this version here. And if we look at this version and compare it to design H, this was less than 1% improvement from it. But the main reason that this is just because now we're using 3 legendary stack inserters to unload onto a belt instead of having 4 that was in design H here to unload from the chest. So it's just having 3 instead of 4. So that was the main benefit. The other thing that I practically liked about this design over design H is that the space itself is reduced just by nature of being able to compress and get these belts wrapped around in this direction. So this was nice. The only downside to this design is it's not flippable, so you have to keep it in this orientation and rotate it. So I've created a couple different versions from this design that I'll showcase here next, but that are already pre-built and pre-wired up so that you don't have to flip them. But this is mainly because the smaller they are, the more likely they're going to actually fit on a patch. So that's a consideration that kind of comes into play here for the overall size of them. So this one just being slightly larger and not being able and having to space this miner out significantly further away due to the extra beacons that are up here makes it a little bit harder in practice for me to actually put them down on a patch. So although this is only showing a small percentage improvement, so less than 1% compared to the original design and came up with, I like the fact that we could move just ever so slightly further back these 2 recyclers and then have just a smaller footprint, because then practically it's easier to get it onto a patch. You can get more of these designs on one patch than you could otherwise. So let's dive through a couple kind of design signatures that I thought were really interesting. So here is design B on the top and design C is on the bottom. And when we talked about these before, right? So we have these 2 designs here, and we'll pull these up. The 4 differences, again, was one was clocked and the other one wasn't. What's interesting is you see that the overall entity update time, by nature of these being clocked, has a much larger period where there is nothing happening. So whereas here there is a constant update that is happening, even though we're voiding the exact same amount of materials, by clocking them and by allowing the recyclers to actually rest and back up with inventory, it seems that we are this really looks like a compression graph. So this looks like you're compressing the number of items and entity updates that are happening in any individual tick. So this this particular one is the one that I want to showcase, because there was the whole reason I explored this originally was my theory was this: if you can void as many items that you can in one specific tick, then the statistics that are updated by the game and also the number of inventory transactions that are happening are in essence lower, because if you're voiding 14 items per tick, then by nature that means that if you're only avoiding one item every single tick, that means that every single tick there's going to be a calculation that happens to happen for every one item out of the 800 that you have to destroy per second. Whereas if you're doing it now at 14 items, well, now you have 14 items less that you have to go and update the overall statistics that you see in Factorial. And then by statistics, I mean the graph that you show when you look at the production stats. So that seems to be kind of applicable here. And so I want to give a shout out to you. You wound up actually running a profiler to analyze this. So what we wound up finding out from that was it actually is true. It seems like 1.5 thousand samples out of the 10,000 that are spent calculating the production statistics that are spent just calculating the production statistics while voiding ore. So that seems to be a hot code path, is when it's consuming the ingredients and then outputting them, there is the flow statistics that are getting updated. And those two right there that are highlighted are taking up a 1.5 thousand out of the 10,000 samples, right? So that is a not cheap thing to be doing. So the every single tick, if you can be removing more items in that individual tick, then you are in essence going to update the statistics less often. And I think this is just going to be a general thing across the board, especially when we're in legendary items and like in general. The number of crafts that can happen in an individual tick means that if you can create, let's say just as an example, if you can create 2,000 green circuits in one tick, then the statistics in one specific building, let's say, and statistics only have to update once in that one tick for that. So the flow statistics are then removed. If you go and craft now those 2,000 items over 100 ticks, well, now you have 100 updates to the flow statistics that need to be calculated. So, and by that means the statistics that show up in the, again, just the graphs and the production stats. So it seems like in general, cramming as many items as you can up to a point, right? If you can't get, you don't want to over beacon things, because beacons have in general have a cost too. But this is where this whole balance of items comes in. So like if you just want to optimize for statistics, then craft as much as you can in a single tick. If you can't, then anyway. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So that kind of proves the theory that yeah, it does matter in terms of what you're actually voiding. In conclusion, where I'm kind of going with this is that it seems like the main takeaways are that over beaconing recyclers improves per tick voiding. We talked about that because that shows in the statistics. It suffers when not clocked due to inserters not having back pressure when inserting into the recycler. It also, the starts or stops are very frequent on recyclers, allowing them to not void as much per tick as they possibly could if not clocked. So overbeaconing is good, but you have to clock the recyclers. This is also going to be useful for Fulgora when we get there, because there's certain items that have a very low utilization that are constantly could be destroying more items per tick, but aren't due to being limited by the inserter throughput. So, and then updates the statistics more often, right? So then constant production on recyclers. So this seems to having constant production is better than overbeaconed and no clocking due to back pressure on inserters. We saw that with design F versus design B, right? So just again to highlight that, there was, again, just to reiterate this, if you come back up here, let's go and look at design B, which we have up here, and let's look at design F. So you can see that these two designs, again, just comparing these two, design B and design F performed very similarly, but had significantly less beacons. So it's mainly just because this recycler is constantly voiding as much as it can. And then F wound up just being a little bit better, just due to the fact that the overall, that the clocking was not exactly perfect up here, which we showed originally. And then as we continued to get the clocking perfect, then we saw slight improvements from there. So still over beaconing is good because you can void more items per tick, but there's diminishing returns, right? Like we saw, there's like 12 items per tick that you're voiding versus 14. It's not a huge difference in respect to this. So that is a big item that comes with recyclers. And then finally, yeah, So clock recyclers with overbeaconed gain, like that are overbeaconed, gain the benefit of per tick ore voiding reduction while I should have actually, I gotta update this. They basically they update the per tick ore voiding reduction while gaining the benefits that you would get from actually like keeping the recycler starting and stopping exactly in a period and never completely running out of ore and then losing back pressure inside the chest that you have here. So those are like the overall conclusions that we have for recyclers. I know this is a lot of information, so I'll show a couple examples of how you can use this, but I want to say, like, why do you even want to explore this? Well, I have actually gone and I created 2 copies of my Megabase, and I wound up using these new recyclers specifically in that so that we can test those out. So I'll show that here next so that I can explain, like, do you actually see a real benefit in game in a real base from clocking the recyclers? And I'll show that here next. We're back in my actual Megabase. Here I've got all my Spidertrons here just so we can actually go and see this area. I don't have radar coverage for these areas, so I'll just kind of showcase this. This is this exact setup, but I've created a version that can make 960 items per second by kind of creating this template and blueprint book here. So I'll release this so that other people can use them, but the main idea behind this is just having a few of these kind of uncommon modules that I've been creating over time. And we have one version that is the 480 per second version. There's one that is the 1920 per second version, which you're seeing here. That's what I've used. And then there's also the 480 per second version itself. So just those different copies so that you can wind up seeing like how do you actually connect all the circuits, and then a couple different flavors. So I'll release this as a blueprint book so that people can use them. The main thing that you're seeing here is that you have one clock, again, for everything in here. Everything is shared across everything. And let me get my actual night vision goggles on because I can't see anything. So let's go put that on. Great. Okay. So there's one circuit that kind of comes across here, connects all these items up, and then you can see that then there's going to be a connection that comes across and forms those by these connections coming across here, and that connects to the, specifically here, there is just a signal that is going to be going across for the undergrounds that are going into the recyclers. So all these recyclers are voiding materials at the same time, all connected. Otherwise, I've also added some efficiency modules just to reduce a little bit the pollution from these, because that's a useful thing in general. Otherwise, if you don't have this, what winds up happening is these create here 40 per minute, and then by adding that, and I need to not request trash unrequested items, so let's remove that there. Okay, thank you. Fantastic. Go back to crashing it. So now we're back down to 8 per minute. So that pollution reduction, might as well just do it because I'm still running with pollution on, so it's worth it for me to do that. Otherwise, I can't do very much for the pollution that these are creating, but at least that way we're reducing the overall pollution count by a lot, which is useful. Anyway, so this is almost constantly running. Where does this feed? Well, if we follow this along, this giant sea of ore here is what is getting fed right now into the steel furnaces that are crafting steel for purple science. So what did I wind up doing? So I said, all right, well, cool. I've done this. I replaced this for all of the different types of miners. So the copper for iron, and then the stone was already improved on. There's nothing to do there. And we've done that in previous episodes. Iron, and then copper here for blue. So we had just designed this in the previous episode. And then you're seeing here that there is copper kind of coming out from here, and then iron being produced in the exact same manner. So I replaced those, replaced the same for the copper up here that's going into the red circuit design that I have, and then also doing the same thing for green. I'd have to bring the Spidertrons up to be able to show that. And then here we see we have that same design here, but now being used for flowing into the green science itself. So the concept here was, okay, let's take those, and I tried to get as best as I could the number of lanes that I actually need for consumption into each of the different sciences as best as I could, because I don't have now the nice starting and stopping cycles that I had before, which I mentioned earlier. And let's just see, can we get an overall improvement? So let's go back into VS Code and I'll show what the results were. So I wound up running my Megabase for 10 minutes itself, running only mining productivity, one with the old miners and the new miners, just to kind of get an overall sense of this. And we wound up seeing that it was 3% worse with the old miners. So overall, it makes a substantial difference in my particular base, just due to the fact that I'm heavily utilizing these for all sciences. So that so this actually had a real tangible impact. So it seems like this is useful across the whole entire save file. So 3% is nothing to scoff at, right? It's going from 68 total whole update time microseconds down to 6572. It's a pretty decent difference. So that seems like a win. The other thing that exists though is when I looked at like the time series graphs, you can see like there's the overall just like average kind of went down for entity update time. So that was kind of nice to see. It's kind of hard to actually get this into an exact window where I'm only running mining prod, so there is some inherent noise. So I tuned the numbers themselves to be exactly within a snapshot of it. The reason for that is when I first ran this, I ran into a problem where I saw actually a percent worse from the new miners. And I was going like, that doesn't make any sense to me. Like, I know this should be better in general, just from the way that we have clocked everything, like everything should be better for this. But when I looked into it, what I wound up seeing was over a large period of time, well, there's this large spike that happens here. So what is this large spike in entity update time that's happening? And I saw this also a small amount happen in the old miners as well. So this wasn't perfectly noise free. So like this is the area where we're doing pretty much just mining productivity. And then there's this large spike that happens. But when I went to that particular spike, guess what's happening? Well, I just ran out, Gleba had just rotted on Novice, so a ship comes back, and then we go produce more Gleba science, and that is that giant spike that you wind up seeing here in 2 waves as 2 ships come in, back to back, needing more Gleba science. So it makes me realize I really need to optimize and figure out some way to have Gleba completely stop when I'm not running it. Like, if I don't need Gleba science, it would just be fantastic if I could just turn it off completely. So anyway, so that's why I ran a new one and created new snapshots of the base when the Gleba science had just been picked up, had fully stopped, and I had a nice 10-minute sample where I could actually test them. And once I did that, that's where we saw that the overall entity update time actually had a decent change. So in my particular base, that's a 200 millisecond or microsecond update time. So 0.2 milliseconds. So nothing to scoff at. So it seems like that's I think this is about as good as I can get with just avoiding ore. So why am I doing this? Just so that people know. I'm doing this because I'm trying right now to build up to being able to compare Q1 versus Q2 with using voiding ore as a tactic. And I'm trying to compare them. That'll be hopefully one of the next videos here of doing red, green, and blue all together. And so I'm going to send a couple more mini series on like the labs themselves. So I'm going to do some testing on that. Is there a net cost to labs themselves? And then ultimately see like, can we then do a final test, including labs with red, green, and blue science, so that we can get an understanding of like, okay, how much do these things impact it in a real game? And is there like, is it close? Q2 versus Q1? Is Q2 worse? Is Q1 better? And so we'll see that as we get into the next parts of this. But before I get to that, I'm trying to do my absolute best effort to have all these things optimized as much as possible for that final test. And so just wanted to give a short update here on some of the things that I've been trying to go through, and so that you can follow along, understand some of my thought processes, see kind of what my insights are on recyclers, and then as we get to the final analysis, that we can all feel pretty confident in that is Q2 better than Q1 or not. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe if you want to see that. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. My name is Abuck Nasty. Have a fantastic rest of your day.